The webinar with a welcome address. And good morning to all. Thank you so much for the overwhelming response to the webinar organized by the Department of Sociology and Population Studies, Bharathiar University, Coimbatore, Tamil Nadu. To give a brief overview about the Department of Sociology, the department actually started in the year 1979 as a extension center of University of Madras. Later when they started the Bharathiar University, Coimbatore in 1983, then this department came under the university. Since then, the department is offering postgraduate program, MPhil program, and PhD program. Many of the alumni of this department is in a bigger positions in government services as well as in academic services, and many of them got retired also. Okay, so I can say proudly that I am also alumni of the same department. And so with this small note, I think about the department, I am really happy to sit before you to give a welcome address. This webinar about insights into contemporary sociological thoughts is conceived by understanding the need of postgraduate students and research scholars who are in the process of preparing for the NET and JRF examinations. Actually, whatever the authors we are going to cover in 4 days, starting from today, all these topics are very closely, related to the NET JRF syllabus. So in this connection, we actually plan to invite renowned faculties from premium institutions with institutions with national importance. In that line, we are fortunate to have Dr. Ratheesh Kumar, Assistant Professor, Center for the Study of Social Systems, School of Social Sciences, Jawaharlal Nehru University, Delhi. Sir, on behalf of Department of Sociology and Population Studies, Bharathiar University, Coimbatore, and all the participants, I welcome you, sir, wholeheartedly. And we are really honored to have you as a resource person of today's webinar. Hope your presentation would really, enlighten the participants. I think because past the whole lockdown, I am following many webinars, but for this webinar, I think it's a great response. Okay, because everywhere, every part of the country, they are very curious to listen to the sessions of resource persons. So in that line, I think we are happy to start with you, sir. And now I hand over the mic to Dr. Suresh Babu, sir. He'll introduce the resource person and introduce the topic. Thank you so much, sir, for the opportunity. Welcome, sir. Welcome to all the participants. Welcome to all the participants, faculties, scholars, students for this webinar. Thank you so much.
Hello. Good morning, sir. Sir, audible?
Yes.
Yes. Sir, good morning, everyone. It's an immense pleasure to invite all the participants, especially from all over India. And today we have an excellent chief guest from Jawaharlal Nehru University. He's my friend of mine. And first, before that, I want to appreciate and congratulate my Bharathiar University Vice Chancellor, Dr. Kaliraj, and Registrar of Bharathiar University for giving us a chance to organize webinars lecture series in this platform. And we got a proper permission from them, and it's a really great for these administrators who are helping us in many ways. And before that, I just wanted to thank my LAB department, Dr. Sambat Kumar, along with him and Dr. Prabhu and other guest faculty. We are working here, and we are going to introduce a renowned scholar, Dr. Ratheesh Kumar. He has done his PhD in IIT Bombay, and he has worked in IIT Tata Institute of Social Sciences, IIT Bombay as Research Associate, and also he taught in Hyderabad Central University as an anthropologist, and also he taught in IGNOU, New Delhi. And again, currently he's working as an assistant professor in Jawaharlal University, Center for Study of Social Systems. School of Social Science, Jawaharlal University, New Delhi. And he has published a lot many articles in national and international journals, and he has done many projects. And his area of specializations are social education, critical pathology, pedagogy, popular culture, sound studies, media, anthropology, debates in ethnography, and a number of specialization. Currently, is teaching in sociological theories in Jawaharlal University. Sir, on behalf of Bharathiar University, Department of Sociology and Population Studies, we wholeheartedly welcome you, sir, for great lectures on postmodernism and post-structuralism, the two important philosophers called Michel Foucault and Bourdieu. We know very well about the postmodernism. Is an excellent philosophy in which it created history. It's not only theory, it's also praxis. And many where this postmodernism and post-structuralism brought out a kind of revolution in the entire part of the world. That is the postmodernism, bringing a great insight to the marginalized sections of population. They may be women, they may be race, African American, or Dalits, tribal, or any people, transgender, or any people who are gay or lesbian. Many people who really inspired by this philosophy and getting into the revolutions. And this is the philosophy we are now in entire part of the world, and especially in India, following the postmodernism, post-structuralism. It is nothing but a deconstruct social reality and going back to the past glory of every communities of the world. No communities are inferior, and no communities are superior. That's what the postmodern wanted to emphasize. So, and today we are having the great lectures by Dr. Ratheesh Kumar, a great renowned scholar, and on behalf of Bharathiar University, I welcome you, sir, for this webinar series. Thank you, sir. Please welcome, sir, and please deliver the lecture. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. I am really overwhelmed to be here. And at the outset, before I begin what I wanted to say, I would like to thank Professor Sampath Kumar, the head of the Department of Sociology and Population Studies, Bharathiar University, and also my friend who has actually initiated, inviting me to this excellent platform to discuss theory, Dr. Suresh Babu. And I thank the whole team of the Department of Sociology and Population Studies who worked really hard to make this event possible in the time of crisis. We are all, struggling to find our ways, and we are living in the time of fear, and still we leave some room to discuss our interests in sociological theory and its possibilities of understanding society. So I would begin with a small note to say that please cut short your large expectation about this talk, precisely because the topics given to me is slightly, I would say it is vast. It contains the domains of theoretical shifts that took place in the 1960s and 60s in the name of postmodernism and post-structuralism, and which have been discussed thoroughly in different platforms, and with special reference to the scholarship and the contributions of two renowned French intellectuals in the 20th century, especially in the second half of the 20th century, who made profound impacts in the field of social theory, Michel Foucault and Pierre Bourdieu. And both demand a lot of intellectual excavations into their wide-ranging interests, themes, concepts, and theoretical orientations that they contributed to the field of knowledge. And it will be very, very difficult and a daunting task in front of me to make a coverage of their entire contribution. So I'm not really, venturing into take up that challenge. What I would do is that I will be focusing only on certain portions of their contribution, their scholarly works related to certain concepts and theoretical postulates that will enable us to think the use or the application of theory into the understanding of our everyday reality in the societies and cultures which are familiar to us, which are close to our own everyday life. So in a way, how the theoretical contributions developed by both Bourdieu and Foucault will be useful for us to make our own understanding about our own society and culture, and also to engage in a debate where theories are undergoing tremendous shifts, refashioning, reconstitution, and reconceptualization. So we can see the journey of theory in these two scholars' endeavors in wide-ranging domains. If we look at the contributions of both Bourdieu and Foucault, they are interdisciplinary in nature, and they are distributed in the fields of humanities and social sciences, and also into some debates in the field of natural sciences. So one can see the horizon of the thinking, the promise of theory in the fields of social life, which we can think and apply, and the ways in which we can take up these theories not only in the debates but also in our practice of research. So that way, these contributions and the scholarly contributions are very heavy and very dense and very intensive, and for that matter, I will be confining to certain conceptual postulates and theoretical orientations of both these scholars, and we will see how we can make use of these theories for our own understanding. So with this note, I have a small set of slides which will be complementary, which will be useful for in addition to what I talk. And I request the organizers to please give me a reminder when and where I should stop, so that we can have some discussion. So let me just try opening this slide, and then we'll just begin. I hope this slide is visible.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Yes, sir, it is visible, sir.
So, yeah, I'll make this presentation with a structure. I will start with Pierre Bourdieu's concepts of habitus, field, and capital, and we'll see how he develops this theory of practice. And then we will move on to Foucault. And finally, if time permits, we can see what are the complementarities and what are the parallel lines of thought that these two scholars occupy. When we can see that Bourdieu's methods are mostly connected to the disciplines of anthropology and sociology, where one can see Foucault deploys historical methods mostly in his approach to theory. And then we can look at the possibilities of deploying these ideas and concepts in our own practice of sociology. So before I begin with Bourdieu's understandings about social life in order to develop these concepts, we would see in general what is the nature of theory when it comes to our pedagogy and our practice. When I see practice as, our endeavors in research. So when we look at our...
Excuse me, sir.
Yes?
Slide is not visible, sir.
Is it?
Yes, sir. Slide is not visible.
No, ma'am. Actually, slide is visible, and you go and click the presentation. There is a tab, presentation. Ratheesh, the same name, presenting. That will be there. So click on that, the slide will be visible.
Yeah, I think the slide is visible. Maybe the individual users of their laptop, they can actually check what are the technical issues with it. Yeah.
Sorry for the interruption, sir.
There is a, sorry to, there is a slight issue with the sound. I can hear a lot of jarring. So can it be so that the sound can be clear to everyone?
Yes, sir. I think your sound is very clear to all of us, sir.
Is it?
Okay.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
yes, sir.
Right,
Yes.
yeah.
So all of you, please mute your audio, video also. Video also.
Mute the audio.
Mute your
That will
video.
mute the
Audio
yeah.
and video, both. So I think many of your videos still on. And Prabhakaran sir, don't present. Okay, just leave. Yes.
Yeah. Now it's better.
Yeah. So Muthalakshmi ma'am, please mute your video. Mute your video. Mute your video, ma'am. Yeah. Yes. Yes, sir.
I
Please.
think now I can I'm fine with this.
Yes, sir. Please, sir. Please. Yeah.
So let's see how theory matters in our sociological practice. So when we take a look at the ways in which we encounter theory in our academic life, basically I am talking about the pedagogical strategies through which we meet theory in our academic activities. For example, when we look at our course outline in general, this is a very commonsensical understanding about how do we learn theory, how do we engage with theory, because we have a set of courses related to theory and we have courses related to methods. Primarily these are related to methods of data collection and analysis, which will be enabling the research scholars to work through their proposed research. And then we have a set of courses which are related to the specific socio-cultural milieu in which one learn about society and culture, or sociology or anthropology as disciplines. For example, when we are studying in India, we will get to see societies, courses related to society in India, courses related to religion, courses related to kinship, and these are all tied within the Indian society as a whole. So we have courses are structured in this fashion. So when it comes to the understanding of theory, we deal with theory as a form of understanding those theories, understanding those debates. But when it comes to the practice of our research, there is a greater detachment happens, that theories are found as some sort of a discrete entity in our research writings. I'm talking about when students, when they engage with theory at their research level at MPhil and PhD. So there is a disjuncture. This is part of our engagement with theory. And this generally happens when we read Bourdieu or Foucault. We read and understand those theoretical propositions and their theoretical contributions. But when it comes to the understanding of our own society and culture, somehow there is a gap in taking theory as a tool or as a lens to understand our own social milieu, and when it comes to the application of our understanding in our research, application of theory in our research setting. So Bourdieu actually tried to fill this gap, and his scholarship, if we see throughout, he is trying to see the possibility of how one can bridge the gap between theory and practice. So if we go to the major concerns of Pierre Bourdieu, I think, for an audience of sociologists and anthropologists or social science scholars in general, Pierre Bourdieu needs no introduction. That's what my belief is. He's a French intellectual actively contributing to the field of both sociology and anthropology, but also his understandings contribute in the areas of literature, humanities, philosophy, and other allied disciplines like media studies, cultural studies, etc., etc. Bourdieu began his career as a social scientist with his ethnographic work among the Kabyles of Algeria. And this is an ethnographic work that he pursued in the beginning of his career, and later he moved on to the making of more macro sociological theories and concepts, which we are looking at some of his contributions at present. So, as I mentioned already, his major concern is to see the dichotomy between certain perception about societies. Say, for example, we have issues related to subjectivism and objectivism, issues related to structure and agency. These are theoretical and conceptual issues underpinning social science thinking in the 20th century. So, Bourdieu's ideas go. So I have lot of I have lot of disturbances in my headphones, so I am unable to hear my own voice. Sorry for this technical error. Yeah. Hello.
Yes, sir, you can continue there.
Yeah. I think some microphones are on. That's why I think.
Yes,
yeah. So if others can switch off these microphones, so I am unable to hear myself. Yeah. Okay. So what I was trying to say is that Bourdieu's attempt is to reconcile these binaries or readjust this dichotomous relationship between subjectivism and objectivism in social theory, and the concepts of structure and agency, how they can be reconciled. And then Bourdieu also was interested in understanding the concept of class, which he takes from Marx, and then how it can be extended further to the conceptualization of social class, which I will be talking about it in the discussion on capital. So let's see, when we see the major concerns which Bourdieu had in its mind, and he developed through the ideas of habitus, field, and capital, in order to understand what is the idea of social practice. So the practice turn, which is celebrated in the 1970s and 80s, primarily came through the thinking and working of Bourdieu's concepts like habitus, field, and cultural capital, especially the forms of capital, what he developed from a kind of reconstructing the idea of capital from an economic perspective, how it can be stretched further into the understanding of capital within the framework of social and the cultural. So, talking about his scheme of thoughts, which are guided through the principles of habitus, field, and cultural capital, we need to take a close look into these three dimensions of his thinking and how these ideas contributed to his understanding of what he calls practice and social practice. So let's look at the idea of field in order to contextualize the discussion, how we can reach the idea of social practice in Bourdieu's own conceptual terms and references. So when Bourdieu started looking at social reality, he devised an idea to understand social practices within certain segments of social life, which he calls social spaces, where the individuals are encountering other individuals and institutions, social positions and hierarchies, which are located in a particular social setting. That's what he called the idea of the field. And fields produce certain specific values, certain orientations, certain judgments, and then fields are produced with certain positionalities. Individuals are positioned in certain fields with certain hierarchies, and there are value orientations through which the human actors are presupposed to act in particular ways. So in his understanding of the field, one can see these are what Bourdieu calls social microcosms, which generates certain value orientations and commonsensical understanding about the world. And Bourdieu's version of the common sense, that he puts it under the term called doxa. So doxa for him, it's a learned, fundamental, deep-seated or deep-founded ideas about the universe, which are some sort of a self-evident truth, which doesn't need any particular verification or validation. So doxas are a set of ideas that people believe as self-evident truth. And every field produce these sort of guidelines through which the actors are expected to perform their social life. So while performing these social life, as we mentioned, there's a structural conditioning that every field would entail. So fields are or fields can be situated in the locations of economy, polity, religious settings, and we can actually categorize this relative autonomy where objective relations are found in order to see how different fields produce different characteristics, so that the individual's expectations and the level of their performance also get shifted according to the nature of the field. So field is, in a way, it's a structural conditioning in a specific location, which are guided by certain value orientations according to which the individuals perform their social life with other individuals and institutions. And hierarchy and positions are the features of the fields situated in different social and political arenas. So the existence of individuals in particular fields produce different kinds of struggles and contestation for recognition. So this is the characteristics of the field, that fields and social spaces are the site of social interaction and productions of meaning in different ways. So let's move on to the idea of habitus and how habitus and fields are intersected with each other. Otherwise, how habitus, when it encounters the field, what really happens? So for that matter, we need to see what is habitus. Habitus is a complex construct in Bourdieu's scheme of thinking, and which had actually gone or subject to different transformation at different levels of his scholarship. So we can see how with the beginning of his work in the outline of a theory of practice to the forms of capital, then distinction, a social critique of the judgment of taste, the logic of practice, all these works, we can see how habitus becomes one of the key tools in Bourdieu's scheme of thinking. So let's see what Bourdieu means or refers to when he calls something that is habitus. One can actually see habitus is an idea or is a principal force that actually combines or that coincide within it the structural condition, and at the same time it is embodied with personal histories and subjective vocations. So one can see there is a combination, the complex Habitus is a complex combination of the structural condition, that is of the objective world, which is embedded or inscribed in the individual's body or the biological entity, in which you can see personal histories are enmeshed, and how both objective conditions, so the structural objective conditions in a social milieu, interacts with the personal histories and subjective vocation of the individual. So ultimately, habitus is a way of thinking and acting in a particular social milieu. And this social milieu, Bourdieu terms it as the field. So habitus is some sort of propensity, tendency, and it's a generative principle through which practices are constructed or generated. So habitus incorporates in the body of it the personal histories, subjectivities that are developed through the forms of socialization and enculturation, which is a product of the social or structural conditions in which one individual grows up. But when he discusses the idea of habitus in a definitional mode, Bourdieu talks about it as a more or less durable, permanent dispositions, which are also transposable, which entails structured structures, which refers to the objective conditions. It's already structured by the structural conditions, but also it predisposes the functioning of structuring structures. That is the potential, the potentiality of the individual's agency. So how the individual agency can respond to the structural condition that is the product and process of habitus. So in a way, habitus mediates between individual agency, the subjective vocation, and also the structural condition. That is part of the objective relations through which we all get socialized into. But the idea of the habitus for Bourdieu is not just a concept to debate around, or it's just a concept that people can understand for the sake of a theoretical orientation. Rather than, habitus is a tool, or habitus is a conceptual tool that can be useful in a methodological sense. Or we can see the application of habitus in different research arenas, especially to study the processes of domination and subordination. So this we can see in the scholarship of scholars like Paul Willis when he was studying working class children's aspiration in schools, and we can also see scholars like Diane Ray and Roy Nash. They all applied the concept of habitus as a method in the understanding of domination and subordination in the educational settings, especially in schooling cultures in Europe. So that way, habitus is not just a concept for a debate in theory, but it is a potential tool to understand the dynamics of social relation, especially when we understand the process of domination and subordination in a particular social milieu. So how a field constrains the individual with certain forms of doxa, common sense beliefs, self-evident truth, which are part of the structural condition, and how, in other words, an individual responds to these structural conditioning, and how the individual's agency becomes or expresses its own capability to work with work through or work against the structural conditioning. So that's what Bourdieu talks about, the possibility of habitus to be transposed in different social conditions, and it has that evolutionary potential. It is habitus cannot be understood as a static form of principle that enable the enable social practice or human action. So let's see how the functioning of habitus in individuals' minds and bodies that reconcile the relationship between structure and agency. So one can see when we talk about different ways of thinking, different ways of speaking, different ways of acting in or performing in a social setting, how one can see that's the outcome of what we call the social practice. When we see particular ways of living in the world, or particular ways of speaking, particular ways of thinking, and particular ways of performing. Say, for example, when we ask a question, why the English prefer beer over wine, or why the French prefer wine. And when we see certain societies, why certain societies are more religious than others. So when we see Scandinavian countries, or when we see a country like New Zealand, why the percentage of believers, religious believers, are relatively less compared to other countries or societies. And does it have certain kinds of impact in their overall social life, or what produced, or how we can see this sort of social practices are generated by what kinds of habitus? So can we see a particular habitus functioning in particular ways to produce a distinct kind of social practices? So this is the way in which we can think about tracing the properties and characteristics through which the habitus is formulated, and how this habitus can be understood in order to see the underlying principles of a social practice. So in order to see these dynamics, we have to see how much and what sort of relations, or what sort of intersections and interfaces that both structure and agency perform in particular settings among individuals and among classes. When we are talking about classes, I'm not really referring to the conventional way of understanding class in a Marxian framework, but in a Bourdieuian sense of understanding social classes. So Bourdieu uses habitus in multiple ways. Especially he uses habitus to understand the individuals at an individual level. And also we can see not only Bourdieu but other scholars use habitus to understand certain kinds of class configuration, as what we call the French working class habitus, or the French middle class habitus. So different scholars have made use of habitus to understand how the ways of living and social practices can be traced through the functioning and principles of habitus. And especially how habitus as a concept can see the relationship, the complex relationship between structure and agency, and how the complex relationship between structure and agency can be understood through the exploration of habitus in order to study social practice. So this is a way in which we need to see the scope of habitus to study social practice. So let's see how habitus encounters the field through the functioning of capitals. So when field and habitus represents the structural conditioning and also the potential individual agency that can impinge on that structure through the functioning of habitus, and this relationship between the field, the encounters between the habitus and the field generates particular kinds of social practice. But in between, there is a concept that Bourdieu develops, that's the idea of the capital. So here, in the forms of capital, Bourdieu takes up the question of understanding capital from a Marxian sense of looking at it from its economic dimension. So we all know that capital is an essential part of means of production in the scheme of understanding the mode of production in capitalist society, and it is the accumulation. It's an outcome of the accumulation of surplus value by the capitalist having a monopolistic ownership over the means of production, and capital becomes an essential condition in the mode of production in the capitalist society. So here we are talking about capital in its materialistic sense, that the capital, that the economic capital that can be converted easily into money and that can be institutionalized into property rights. So here we are talking about the materiality of the capital. So here comes Bourdieu's intervention into stretch out or extends the idea of extending the idea of capital from its economic understanding to the other forms which he calls social and cultural. So Bourdieu's understanding of the capital goes on to its representation in fundamentally in three guises. This is economic capital, which we have already discussed, and then social and cultural capital. Before we go on to cultural capital, which becomes one of the key properties of Bourdieu's analytical scheme, we'll see what social capital entails. Social capital suggests the membership in powerful networks in a given social milieu, and how this membership that can be converted into economic capital by reproducing the relationship, the enduring relationship within social network that can yield certain life chances and advantages for certain individuals to perform in a social setting. So social capital refers to the level of relations that one can build by constituting one's own membership in powerful relational networks or networks of relations. When it comes to the idea of cultural capital, Bourdieu takes a very interesting stand. And here comes the idea of capital, which can be understood as anything that can command some sort of cultural value in a particular social or cultural context. So certain resources that an individual can avail, that can produce or that can command certain social positions, ranks, prestige, honor, and that is symbolically understood as having certain cultural values and prestige. And here comes the way in which Bourdieu conceptualizes cultural capital in its three different dimensions. So cultural capital can be, understood in the, way of the expressive qualities of an individual. It can be bodily performances. It can be, the way of speech, articulation with a specific accent. It can be of, different ways of clothing, which will carry certain cultural weightage in a particular social milieu, and which is also produced through certain institutionalized identities, through having certain educational qualifications. So for Bourdieu, cultural capital exists in three fundamental forms. One is the embodied form of cultural capital, which actually suggests how certain personal qualities are attached to certain individuals in the way of speech, in the way of mannerisms, in the way of certain attitudinal or behavioral qualities and characteristics, which can earn certain aesthetic value, or the value that is coming from certain tastes and attitudes developed towards certain cultural domains or products. It's something like embodied, which is deep-seated in that way. It is not easily convertible, or it is not easily transmittable to other individuals in direct manner. So, for example, it takes long time to accumulate a cultural capital, like intellectual capacity, or a cultural or an aesthetic sense of attitude towards music or attitude towards art. So these are these abilities acquire a long investment of labor and time, and which cannot be easily transposable, which is cannot be convertible into through economic transactions. Cultural capital can also exist in objectified forms. Apart from its embodied status, it can exist in objectified forms. It refers to the ways in which people having possessions of goods and material objects which are having certain aesthetic values. So, for example, souvenirs of certain kinds, paintings, art products, social artifacts which are having certain cultural value, machines, musical instruments. And the objects are always in relation to the owner or the person who actually possess these materials. So there is a difference. It is not easily convertible to economic capital, but its conversion also depends on the idea that who owns it and what are the characteristics of these objects which are owned by a particular individual. So owners, class, their ranks and hierarchy in society actually matters at the relationship between those objects and the individuals who own that. So the objectified form of cultural capital depends on the classes in which people belong to, and how certain objects can command more cultural value in a given setting. So why the taste for antiques actually matter for some people, not to all people, and why certain kinds of clothing are attached to some classes or some social classes in a given social milieu. So we can actually think about the possibility of understanding the embodied state of cultural capital and the objectified form of cultural capital. And there's a third dimension of the cultural capital, that is the institutionalized form of cultural capital, that is primarily earned through educational qualifications. So educational qualifications in a prestigious educational institutions like the degree from Harvard, or when we talk about India, the degrees from IITs or IIMs. So certain institutions are labeled with certain social status, prestige, and they occupy in the higher stage of development or hierarchy or social positioning. So these the membership of these institutions that enable individuals to create these particular form of social cultural capital, that is called the institutionalized form of cultural capital. So all these forms or all these guises in which cultural capital exists, they all produce the capital in a symbolic manner. That's why Bourdieu emphasizes on the extension of capital from its materiality to its symbolic dimension. So that's how these capitals exist, both social capital and cultural capital. Cultural capital exists in a way in which we can command certain symbolic meanings, and there's a symbolic power embedded in the resources that we call both cultural and social capital. especially when we talk about cultural capital, when they command certain symbolic power in society, and those who possess cultural capital of these kinds, their habitus will be slightly different from those people who are not really possessing these set of cultural capital. So habitus, the formation of the habitus, also depending on the possession of capital, especially social and cultural capital that an individual can command. So one can see now the forms of capital and its functioning in the making of particular habitus, and that particular habitus encounter with the field that produces particular distinctive kind of social practice in a given social setting. So that's what we are trying to see, that the concepts of field, habitus, and capital, especially cultural capital, they all work in a particular scheme through which the practice is constructed. So there is a problem. Just the slide was not moving. Yes. So we need to see all these three in a chain of relations. So it is important to understand both habitus and field, and how cultural capital enable the formation of particular habitus, and thereby creating a different set of relation within a particular field. So interaction among these three is crucial for Bourdieu's construction of his ideas about social practice. So in distinction, he actually made a very interesting schema that, how when habitus encounters with the cultural capital, otherwise how certain cultural capital enables certain forms of habitus, and when the combination of habitus with certain particular cultural capital, when that encounters the field, specific forms of social practices are generated. So this is the equation he gives in his work, distinction, that habitus into capital plus field generates practice. So let's see how social practice is developed in Bourdieu's understanding. So one can see Bourdieu is approaching the social space in order to see what kinds of practices are generated with the functioning of habitus enabled by cultural capital, or enabled by different forms of capital with special reference to cultural capital. And then when we study social practice, instead of looking at social practice at the surface level, how we can go deep into the level of habitus, and how one can take an exploration into the making of the habitus with an understanding of cultural capital, or with an understanding of capitals in general, then how do we see the making of specific practices in specific social milieu? So in that way, the questions we raised earlier, why certain preferences over food and clothing in particular societies, and why some societies are more religious than others, and why some societies, they distance from religious practices in contemporary times, and does that produce a different kind of social practices? We can see social practices as observable facts for the researcher. So when a researcher observes a social event, a ritual, a dynamics of certain class or social conflict, what is visible in the form of social practice can be studied by going deep into the making of the habitus and its relationship with the cultural capital, and how cultural capital and habitus encounters the field where positions, ranks, and hierarchies, value systems are oriented through certain structural conditions, and how we can study social practice by going back into the making of the habitus, which actually mediates between structure and agency and ultimately generates practice. So this is the schema of Bourdieu's theory of practice in a nutshell. So when we see this, we need to understand that Bourdieu is proposing this scheme of ideas and concepts in order to foreground the possibilities of studying particular societies where one can see specific social practices, how they are generated. But when we see Bourdieu's theories and its application in the Indian context, which is not really, it's not a domain which is fully occupied with rigorous, inquiries, where one can see in Europe, especially in Britain and France, one can see how Habitus as a methodological tool was explored by many scholars, especially in their research in studying social reproduction of educational inequalities, with special reference to the forms of capital in different institutional conditions. So here, when we discuss educational institutions or religious institutions, or when we study different social milieus, one can see we are actually studying social practice. We are studying how a particular practice is generated through the functioning of habitus and capital in specific fields when we go through the scheme that Bourdieu inaugurates for us for a methodological possibility. So more than understanding these as concepts and theoretical orientations, we need to deploy these ideas for a methodological scrutiny that can enable us to expose the structures of practices. So when I'm talking about the structures of practices, we mean how one can see the formation of a particular habitus. So for that, we need to see how capital works. When we understand cultural capital, how we can understand cultural capital within the Indian context. So what kind of cultural capital we can see when we deploy our ideas to study educational institutions, or when we study bureaucracy, or when we study any other social setting in rural or urban context. So how we can see the possibility of applying cultural capital and to unravel the possibilities of studying the formation of particular habitus. So what I try to suggest is that there is an immense possibility of deploying habitus and capitals as tools in order to understand social practices in Indian settings in different fields. When we take fields such as agriculture, fields such as industry, or fields such as educational institutions, fields such as religious institutions. So different fields and one particular phenomenon, how one can see in different fields. So this should be the thrust in engaging with the concepts that Bourdieu developed in his a range of working from his anthropological understanding of the Kabyle community to the studies which he has conducted in 90s about masculinity, gender, the ideas related to the questions of power and hierarchy with reference to sporting cultures, media, and one can see the wide-ranging interest through which Bourdieu applies his concepts of habitus, cultural capital, and field to study social practices in different social spaces. So here, I will take a pause and we can come back to Bourdieu's scheme of thought when we can also see how the Foucauldian notions or the ideas and theoretical possibilities developed in Foucault's scheme of thinking, how they can be called for a methodological understanding in order to study society and culture. As we know, Foucault also belongs to the French intellectual tradition of the second half of the 20th century. We can see both Foucault and Bourdieu taught at Collège de France at the same time, around the late 70s. One can see Bourdieu giving lectures on different topics such as population, the politics of biopolitics, and also the idea of use of pleasure and care of the self. And meanwhile, you can also see Bourdieu taking courses on general sociology and courses on field and habitus in early 80s. So we can see both coming from the same intellectual tradition, but we can't see much interaction between these two scholars, but we can actually see certain parallels and also certain departures. So we don't need to see that the ideas can be equated in some sense, but definitely there are certain parallels one can observe in both their contributions, and both their contributions are more useful in a methodological sense rather than understanding them as only as theoretical underpinnings. This is what I would like to say. So Michel Foucault's contributions, his early works starting from 1961 on Madness and Civilization, progressing through the work on the birth of the clinic and order of things coming in 1966, and then there comes Archaeology of Knowledge in 69, and then Foucault takes a different turn in his approach from 1975 onwards, that we can see in the works of Discipline and Punish and History of Sexualities, 3 volumes before his death in 1984. So as I mentioned earlier, both Foucault and Bourdieu are truly interdisciplinary in nature. And we could see when we discuss postmodern dimensions of social theory in the 1960s and 70s, Foucault becomes an integral figure in that, along with Derrida, Lyotard, Frederick Jameson, and others, many others. And when we talk about post-structuralism, we refer to scholars again like Barth, Derrida, and Bourdieu comes as post-structuralist in a different sense, not through the lines of this, his contemporaries in literary theory. But both these scholars actually, in their own terms, they didn't claim themselves to be or belong to these particular traditions. So these are attributes by looking at their scholarly turns they took in their academic career and their intellectual interventions in the fields of social theory. That's how these labels have actually happened. So you can see when looking at Bourdieu's work, how much post-structuralism gone into his understanding of the idea of social practice, taking a departure from, Lévi-Straussian structuralism for that matter. And then how we can see Foucault responds to the idea of the modern. That way, Foucault's approach to the ideas of the modern and his notions which actually challenged the modern condition became a site for him to be labeled as postmodernist, even though he doesn't make such claims in his writings. Let's see how Foucault's idea of discourse and archaeological method, I will be citing how he moves from archaeological method to genealogical method in his later works. But I would like to say again what I said in the context of discussing Bourdieu's work. Michel Foucault also engaged with wide-ranging issues related to historiography, political philosophy, questions of medical practices and sciences, ideas of institutions and disciplines, and also the final part of his career was invested in the study of sexuality, and also how modern science makes sexuality a site of control in a different way. So he has gone into different domains of social thought, and it will be really, really challenging, and one cannot do justice in a short episode of like this to do a coverage of Foucault's work. So I'm not really going into any sort of attempt to make a coverage of Foucault's work. Rather, I will focus only on these two ideas about discourse and archaeology. So yeah, these are larger, conceptual frames through which one can look at Foucault's contribution. There are ideas related to discourse, and then institutions, the disciplines, and then one can see how his theory of power became one of the key contributions in the history of social theory in the second half of the 20th century, and how he develops this concern about power, what he calls in the medieval period, it was an idea of the sovereign power that actually shifted to the idea of the buyer power in modern period. So we'll look at some of these key concerns very selectively because of the paucity of time, and more importantly, we can also we also should look at what are the methodological possibility of deploying Foucault's ideas into our own understanding of the societies and cultures which we are familiar with, or otherwise how our everyday life experiences in a given social milieu can be informed with Foucault's theoretical contributions. Let's see what is discourse. I mean, for this is a kind, actually a challenge. Those who are familiar with structuralism, then the idea of textuality, the construction of symbolic sign, the relationship between the signifier and signified in structuralist scheme of understanding language. For them, it will be familiar to go into the idea of discourse. So when we talk about discourse, we can see that discourse is a term that is used widely and sometimes taken for granted. So when it comes to the idea of discourse as a construct developed in Foucauldian schema, we can see discourse as a way of speech or a way of thinking. And in a way, we can say that it is larger systems of thought specific to a historic location, what Foucault calls epoch, and then how these particular epoch make certain things sayable and certain things thinkable. So the thinkability and sayability of things became central to the understanding or making of the discourse. So in that way, discourse is socially or culturally produced set of ideas which contains texts. Texts are of signs and codes which are symbolically produced, and texts are full of meanings and meaninglessness. In a postmodern sense, we can see that meanings are not fixed meanings, but they have they offer immense possibility of readability from different social and cultural contexts. So what we are trying to see, these texts which are contained again with representations, and these representations entail or they describe power in relation to the other. So how individuals, groups, and classes are located within a particular discourse that enable people to behave, think, and speak in particular ways. So in that way, discourse can be found in its textuality. Now, when I'm talking about textuality, it is not an idea of text that is written. One can actually textualize a discourse in order to understand its structures at the surface level and the deep level, in order to see how a discourse functions, or discourse produces certain ways of thinking and saying. That's what Foucault terms it as epistemes of different epochs. So a discourse analysis refers to different things for different people. Different discourse analysis is considered to be a qualitative method in order to study the underlying principles that makes possible a social phenomenon that is perceived and understood and lived by people in particular time and space, or particular social setting in a given historical context. So here, Foucault's approach is historical, and discourse analysis also goes beyond Foucault's own construction of this term and its application. So discourse analysis is used at least at two levels. One is at the linguistic level, that we can call the descriptive approach to discourse analysis. So that means it's a kind of a linguistic technique, or scholars of linguistics mainly go into this particular form of analysis, where the analysis goes beyond the construction of a sentence, or beyond the formation of phonemes, morphemes, and syntax, and they work with how the language can be seen beyond its syntactic properties. The next level of understanding, or taking discourse analysis in a methodological sense, that's what we can call it in a Foucauldian sense, that is critical. And critical means it is not simply linguistic or descriptive, but it is more of a political in nature. And that's what we mean by Foucauldian understanding of discourse analysis. So what Foucault takes into consideration in his discourse analysis is to go deep in history to see how certain ways of thinking and certain ways of saying became possible when certain ways of thinking and saying became possible that eventually closed the possibility of seeing and thinking in other ways. So it is, in one way, it is a production of a doxa, in which there are self-evident truth that there is a frame of thinking and knowing, and we cannot really go beyond that frame. That's what discourse actually enables, and that way discourse actually constrains individuals to go beyond that discursive formation. So these discursive formations need to be analyzed, so that one needs to go back in history to understand how a social phenomenon or a concept or an idea is perceived at a particular historical context. So this is what Foucault calls his way of looking at discourse. That is what he called his approach of archaeology, or an archaeological method to see how ideas were confined to certain regimented frameworks. So his approach of archaeology basically suggests what an archaeologist actually does in his or her activity of digging. So this is an attempt of excavation that one attempts to do in order to trace the history in which one can locate what made possible this particular discourse to exist at that particular time, through which an idea became confined to a particular frame. Say, for example, his early works like Madness and Civilization, Birth of the Clinic, Order of Things, they dealt heavily with the understanding of how the idea of madness was perceived. Or in Order of Things, one can see how the idea of knowledge was perceived, or how disciplinary regimes were, originated and classified in the time of post-Renaissance, and especially they became, more compartmentalized in the time of post-Enlightenment, and how science became a way of understanding the world in order to make sense of what we call the truth. So what is truth about madness, and what is truth about the scientific way of understanding the world? So how one can see the historicity of these ideas going back to its formations in different epochs. When we talk about the Middle Ages, maybe 400, 500 years ago, what was the idea of madness in ancient Greece, and what was the idea of scientific knowledge or before science emerged, or what is the idea of truth in a particular setting, that when we take our knowledge back in history. So here, archaeology or the archaeological method necessitates the deep excavation into the making of knowledge through explorations of texts which are available, and they represent the formation of certain discourses. So a discourse analysis in an archaeological method takes different epochs into some sort of comparison. So what was there in a particular time in history about the idea of madness? So in that way, it is a snapshot taken in a given time in history, or a particular period represents an idea in so and so ways. So Foucault was interested in tracing this discursive formation through which an idea became truth in that particular setting. So that way, Foucault takes it as dominant narratives rather than an absolute truth. So he actually traces this historical sense-making of truth, which is contingent on a particular discursive formation, and which produce certain forms of knowledge which are not absolute but dominant. So the dominant narrative qualifies to become truth by the functioning of this discursive formation, and this discursive formation needs to be subject to inquiry through the method of archaeology. And this method of archaeology enables us to take the snapshot of how things were perceived in a particular historical location. So he was trying to compare, different epochs in terms of, understanding different discourses that enabled the idea. of either of madness or of knowledge of truth, how they persist in particular epochs. But Foucault takes a different turn in his approach of archaeology, because he thought that archaeology is limiting, because even though archaeology goes beyond the conscious subjective formations of knowledge, and it takes deep into the discursive formations in particular historical period for taking snapshot for comparison, simple comparison will not yield the understanding of progression from one particular historical period to another period, what really happened. So for this, one has to trace the processes through which one particular discursive formation give way to another set of ideas which entail or what that enable the production of a different episteme in a different epoch. So how did this happen? So this is what he tried to see in his later works, especially when we look at the work of Discipline and Punish in 1975, where he deployed first time the method of genealogy, which I will come to. Yeah. So genealogical method actually suggests this possibility, or this gives a promise how one can see the politics of transformation from one epoch to the other, where a distinct discursive formation enabled the transformation, and how one can see the practices of discipline or disciplining practices of different institutions. So he was taking the case of modern prisons in comparison with the punishment systems in the Middle Ages. So when he was tracing the history of prisons or punitive practices in 17th century to 18th and 19th century, what kinds of transformation took place, and how one can understand this transformation from what he calls, from sovereign power to a disciplinary power, that is more of a power which is not in the form of repression, but in the form of reform. So here, genealogy offers us like a genealogy chart, or a family chart of genealogy, where one can see how relations are built at different junctures in history, and how one can trace each events that give birth to the next event, and how the series of transformation that led to the making of a different epoch, in which one can see the practice or an idea became somewhat different what we perceived. This is an example that he gives about the idea of discipline and punish, what happens in the Middle Ages, and when it comes to the functioning of the modern prison, what changed. So here one can see that in the idea of the modern prison, he talks about how instead of giving ruthless, harsh punishment, even taking lives, and violent and repressive modes of punishing the body or punishing the individual has been replaced by a process of reform. And the process of reform entails aspects like hierarchical observation through his idea of panopticon. He borrows from Bentham the idea of observing from top, how a top-down approach to surveillance. That's what we can see in modern states, how they function with this hierarchical observation to spot people what they are doing, and this is a kind of an invigilation of regulating their practice.
Sir, excuse me,
Yes.
sir. Yeah, this is Sambat Kumar.
Yeah.
Can we wind up in
Yes.
10 minutes, right? 10 minutes, sir.
I will not take 10 minutes. I'll wind up in 5 minutes. Yeah. Thank you for
Thank
the
you so
reminder.
much.
Yeah,
Thank you,
yeah,
sir.
right. So, connecting back, we have a system in modern prisons. That is what the case that Foucault examines in Discipline and Punish, where one can see there is a hierarchical observation through a third eye coming from top. There's the panopticon, and then this panopticon actually enables the inmates themselves to observe others. This is slowly transformed into the lives of the inmates, that they themselves occupy the eye of the panopticon. And this is a very interesting convertibility that Foucault talks about. And then there is normalizing standards, or normalizing the judgment. I mean, instead of regulating the individuals by command or action, the individuals themselves internalize the power of the authority, and they themselves enable by their own performance. What we mean by it, this is what Foucault calls individuals become the sites of docile bodies. They enact what the authorities wanted to administer through them or in them. So that way, the modern institutions like prison, they don't function with harsh, repressive, violent modes of punishment. Rather than doing that, they regulate and control individuals by imposing the instructive mechanisms and technologies of surveillance and regulation in their own lives. So they start enacting what the authority wanted to invest in them. So this is a kind of a transformation Foucault talks about, and the method of genealogy enables him to see this transformation. And then it actually comes in his work of History of Sexuality, the first volume published in the subsequent year when he published Discipline and Punish. And he actually started off with understanding how sexuality also became a site where one can see scientism becomes a way of prevailing mechanism of ordering and controlling and regulating things. This is again, he talks about in a conceptual sense that this is the move from the idea of the sovereign power to the idea of the biopower. So what this idea of sovereign power actually suggests a complete and clean authoritarian approach to control the individuals or the citizens. So in which violence and repression became the modes and motivations in which individuals are controlled. This can be visible and centralized mechanism of taxation, even death penalties in the discourse of sovereign power when it was operated in the Middle Ages to the 17th and 18th century. And when it comes to the modern institutions, forms of disciplining and the disciplining through the operation of power, that's what Foucault calls the transformation of power from sovereign to the idea of the biopower. Biopower brings human bodies into the center of affairs. So how human bodies are brought in the center of affairs, not in the form of violence, but in the form of administering, calculating, regulating, and controlling. So this is what Foucault was trying to study in his works of Discipline and Punish and History of Sexuality. Especially when we come to the history of sexuality, one can see how science invests in the field of sexuality to orient people to become their own how their own sexual lives can be scrutinized, not only through the experts and administrators, but they themselves become conscious about what they do in their sexual orientations and sexual life, which is oriented toward what scientism actually suggests. This is what Foucault calls the science of sexuality. So here one can see there is a gradual progression from the sovereign way of exercising power to the functioning of power, what he calls the modes of biopolitics, or the extension of power in the sense what he calls biopower. So let's see here when Foucault talks about his ideas about power, he actually takes it power in the form of capillary. Power is not really occupies a center, from there it disseminates to different individuals, or there is a clear, unambiguous entity of power which is centered. Rather, Foucault talks about a diffused form of power, which is, in a way, it is an unstable network through which power operates. So it not operates through, not only operating through macro structures, but operates in our everyday setting in micro levels. So that way, power becomes invisible as an entity to be resisted. This is the kind of a conceptual demarcation that Foucault makes from what we can see in a sovereign power, where violence is unleashed from a visible source, whereas power has been administered and calculated through regulating the population and the docile bodies, in which the bodies or the individuals or the citizens themselves become a controlling mechanism, or themselves become agents of controlling mechanisms enabled by the state machinery or the macro regimes of power. So the macro regimes of power transfers its potential duties to individuals themselves, and then power is operated without a visible, tangible center through which one can understand the functioning of power, and it can be resisted. So here, Foucault is talking about a change, a radical shift one can see how authority functions in the operation of power. And when power becomes diffused in the context of biopolitics, how one can make use of this idea into the settings in which we are more familiar with when it comes to the regulation of population, especially individual citizens. Now let's see, I'm offering a methodological possibility to read Foucault's ideas about discourse and power, and we shift from his archaeological method to genealogical method, how these methodological reconfigurations will enable us to understand our own society. This is why especially I was telling the scope of power as a concept. In order to study the modern ways of governmentality, governmentality is a concept Foucault developed in his thoughts and lectures. But since we don't have time, I'm not attempting to go into the details of it. But one can see how the transformation of sovereign power to biopower, in which we can trace the history of transformation of ideas through a genealogical method, and how that genealogical method will be useful for us in order to study micro aspects of power in our everyday life, sanctioned through macro or macro levels of structures and authorities in our contemporary lives. So here comes what Foucault deployed in both archaeology and genealogy, is a promise of historical sociology to be contextualized in our research. Here we can see two different vantage points that both Bourdieu and Foucault takes up. In Bourdieu's scholarship, since he comes from sociology or anthropology background, he doesn't believe in this categorization between anthropology and sociology from the French tradition. He actually doesn't go along with that. So by and large, the orientation of Bourdieu from a sociological vantage point, one can see that Bourdieu is ahistorical, but he gives this promising concepts of cultural capital and habitus into the study of domination and subordination in our everyday setting to locate specific fields in which how both habitus and cultural capital operate. So both are in a way talking about how the processes and products of domination and subordination can be traced from these methodological reconfigured ways or methodologically reconfigured ways. So one from Foucault's discourse analysis, where he transforms himself from archaeology to genealogy. He's also talking about how from a centered notion of power in a sovereign state, when it comes to the modern ways of the functioning of institutions, especially education institutions, prisons, and other modern state machineries, how the idea of capillary power can be traced through a genealogical method. So here I'm trying to call upon the scope, especially in methodology. Even though we are talking about concepts and theoretical postulates, we need to take these forward in our practice. That means in our methodological orientations, how these ideas can be informing our research propensities, tendencies, and attitudes towards understanding our own contemporary societies. Unfortunately, what happens, theory stands separate from our research orientation. It comes only in the chapters of review of literature, which I reiterate to my students, rather than how we can think the contemporary social settings about power, about inequalities, about domination and subordination, how these can be viewed through the concepts provided by both Foucault and Bourdieu. Foucault's ideas of habitus, cultural capital, and the field, and how the interaction among these three constitute social practice, and how power is operated at a micro level, not from a straitjacket idea of the center and the peripheries, or the center, the centered authority to the citizen individual docile bodies. How one can see power operates in an unstable network of relations and hierarchies, and how these can be operated in our methodological settings and orientations. So here, the last point I wanted to emphasize here is that when we engage with concepts and theories, we need to see the potential ground for them to be applied in our research settings, so that these theories can be, or these concepts can be modified, or these concepts get some sort of an extension through the modification of them within a specific research setting which we are familiar with. Now, if you see both Bourdieu and Foucault, they develop these ideas from their own familiar settings. Foucault is going back to history, ancient Greek, and especially medieval Europe in his territory as his subject matter. Bourdieu also looks into societies which are producing certain ways of social practices which can be categorized into different social class features, and not only the class features of the economic kind, but the class features. That's what he developed in his work of distinction, how taste and aesthetic preferences are specific to the classes such as the middle class or the working class, not only in the economic sense, but also in the cultural sense of this idea of the classes. So here we can actually call for an applied notion of these concepts that can be attached to our research and everyday understanding of the social world which we are familiar with. I'll stop here in case any interventions or clarifications, comments, will try to respond to that. And once again, I thank the organizers, Professor Sampath Kumar and Professor Suresh Babu, giving these wonderful opportunities. And I'm not sure I have done justice to this vast field of scholarly endeavors in the limited frame of time, but I hope I am able to connect with you technically and intellectually to some extent. Thank you once again.
Yeah, thank you so much, sir. Certainly, you justified your presence, sir. We all enjoyed your presentation, and I think you spoke for 1 hour 45 minutes.
Oh,
that's really a marathon effort, sir.
Yeah.
We really appreciate your presentation. I think we have 2 questions actually, sir.
Okay.
One from Indra Priyadarshini from Bharathiar University. She's a scholar here.
Okay.
She asked, does it mean Bourdieu's practice and habitus is similar to Parsons' social action and systems?
Okay. It's an interesting question. Shall I answer to this or?
Yeah, please, sir. Answer.
Yeah.
Yes.
I think we can see certain parallels in Parsons and Bourdieu. But what we need to see is that one would say that the idea of habitus comes a little more closer to the Durkheimian understanding of collective consciousness. Yes. So that is one point I wanted to emphasize. And then what is the difference one can see in Bourdieu is that he is taking things at a primordial level to understand classifications. I mean, this I mentioned, one can actually see Bourdieu's ideas in its in their raw material sense when one can see he published his his lectures were published recently in 2019 that he delivered at Collège de France, which is titled Classification Struggles. Okay. And I had an opportunity to review that book recently, which has appeared in Sociological Bulletin last issue, where one can see how Bourdieu developed these ideas from already existing scholarship. Then you can see how Bourdieu is engaging with the already existing sociological scholarship and also the ideas from natural science, and he actually compares how ideas are classified within natural science and social sciences. So there he will find, that's why I'm talking about his ideas of habitus and practice getting close to the idea of Durkheimian understanding of collective consciousness rather than a Parsonian idea of social action. Of course, when we see social practice, Parsonian idea of social action doesn't take into the understanding of this relationship between structure and agency. Otherwise, there was no attempt to reconcile this idea of structure and agency in a way that Bourdieu is attempting to do. So these are some of the differences, and also you can see certain parallels, of course. So the classification struggles, Bourdieu's recent publication, of course, it was published many years after his death in 2019, and then that will become a source material for you to engage with this debate. What he has, what kind of engagement he has with the classical founding scholars of sociology. So yeah, it's an interesting question. Yeah,
yes,
thank
yes.
you. Yeah.
So thank you, sir. One more question, sir.
Thank you. Yeah.
By Dar Mansoor,
Okay.
he asked that where you find the place of transgenders in terms of Foucault's sexuality discourse or discourse analysis.
Yes. See, in history of sexuality, especially in the first volume, he actually begins with the idea of classification again. I mean, this is what, idea of classification from the frame of modern science. So when modern science started identifying these categories, for example, sexuality was an arena of, one can see at one way it's an arena of human pleasure, and also a kind of a, site where site of reproduction. These are the two ways in which we take sexuality for granted, an idea of pleasure. But idea of pleasure was not really granted in a Victorian moral. I mean, one can see that. But when it comes to the modern era, when science started exploring with its classification and categories, then we can see the ideas of heterosexuality started operating in such a way that it is classified strictly into the male-female binary, and the idea of heterosexism became some sort of a normal way of practice. In that, before that, people were not really talking about the categories like homosexual and heterosexual. Once these categories were formulated, obviously heterosexual relations became part of a normative. Obviously, that's what Foucault talks about heterotopia. That it created other worlds within that world. So those people who cannot really occupy within that world, they have actually moved out, or they started living in the peripheries with anxieties and struggles to get some kind of a recognition. So that way, I'm not really saying that Foucault has given a space of to discuss transgender identity in his schema. But I mean, we all know that History of Sexuality is an incomplete project. He actually planned to write 5 volumes, but before writing those things, he passed away. And then that way, I could say that there is a promise of looking at this classification when we formulate a research idea into the lives of the transgender. Of course, Foucault's scheme will offer us certain kinds of insights and also conceptual tools to delve into that. I mean, with one last point, I will stop by saying that this again, one can see there is an interesting discussion that is part of Foucault's lectures that he delivered in 1981, if I remember correctly. For the first lecture in the hermeneutics of the subject, he talks about the care of the self. When care of the self shifted to the idea of knowing the self, what all transformation took place from ancient Greece to the modern French philosophy. He's actually taking care of the self from Socrates. How individuals were asked to care their own selves. But this idea was, shaped in a different way in Descartes' idea of knowing the self. I think, therefore I am, in that kind of a frame. That has become, care of the self shifted to the idea of the knowing the self. This transformation actually tells about the idea of subjecthood. I mean, this will be an interesting take on to, look at subjective experiences when we take care of the self and understanding one's own self. I mean, I'm providing some conceptual, platforms through which, we can actually locate and possibly situate the lives of the transgenders. I hope I could convey my concerns.
Yes, sir.
Here. Yeah, right.
So one more question, sir.
Thank you. Yeah, please.
One more question. Yes, actually Yasser Ashraf.
Okay.
He's a scholar in Bharathiar University. He asked, how is the Bourdieu's concept of capital different from Marxian point of view on capitalism?
Yeah, I think this I actually mentioned in my, if you see this slide on forms of capital, what Bourdieu is trying to say that capital in the Marxian sense, it is the accumulated surplus value by the capitalist by extracting that surplus value. And this accumulation of surplus value is actually required to invest in the next set of production process. That's why, so the capitalist has to do a monopolistic ownership on the means of production to increase this surplus value. But at the same time, one can see this form of capital is existing in its materialistic sense, and it can be easily converted to, the convertibility is somewhat easy. It can be converted to money and it can be transferred. So whereas when we look at cultural capital, it exists in disguised forms. It is not really transferable so easily. Say, for example, if I have a skill of speaking in particular way, I have a skill of singing, I have a taste towards artistic products, or I can play music in my young age, that is that develops certain kinds of social status in me, and that gives some kind of a symbolic power to me, and that elevates my cultural capital, because my skills and abilities are highly valued in a cultural milieu. But this cultural capital cannot be transferred because its existence is in disguise. So I cannot really explain what is this skill. I can perform that, and it is embodied in me. So when it is embodied, and it is an embodiment of both mind and body, it cannot be detached easily, and it requires some investment of labor and time more than the economic capital, because I can buy a land with some money and I can use it for my production process, but I cannot really buy a skill of singing or buy a skill of musical taste for music or any other artistic expression without taking an effort of years and years. Sometimes it people say that it comes through some sort of acquisition genetically. We don't know that. We are debating on that. This is the answer I wanted to share.
Actually, because time constraint, last question, sir.
Yes.
Actually, this is from Akila Johnson. She is also doing a PhD here in Bharathiar.
Yes.
She asked, could you explain relevance of Foucault's biopolitics in the time of COVID-19 pandemic?
Yeah, I can answer, but sometimes it will create some kind of controversies. Anyway, I'm trying to be genuine in that. What Foucault is talking about, it's actually a mechanism of regulating the individual's actions and bodies, and by and large, how a population can be traced through informations. This is actually, you can see a debate among people or different political factions, or about the idea of data, individual data. We are concerned about individual data from the beginning of our Aadhaar UID, and also the debate on Arogya Setu, right? One way people are concerned about how the data can the secrecy or the privacy of the data. What does that mean actually? So why otherwise data required on individuals? So one way one can see that state actually wanted to gather maximum information on certain kinds of calculative bodies. They can be traced. They can be traced for good. One can say that it's for good governance, and people would say that it's not for good governance. It's actually individuals' privacy has been targeted. So these are the ways in which people engage with this question of what you call the privacy of the data about individuals. But one can see what Foucault is trying to say is that this is sort of administering practices that we can see in the time of biopolitics. The information is secured for having an absolute control for regulating and administering life. This is just an example. Forget about, I'm talking only about biopolitics in state versus citizen. We can understand also about other regimes of science and medicine. Say, for example, we know that in our time, generally celebrities they always consult dietitians whenever they wanted to eat an ice cream or some food with some kind of calories and fat content. But generally, you can see people in our contemporary times forget about celebrities. Ordinary people, middle class people will become more conscious about whenever they are eating, about their side effects. That's what we go regularly for health checking. Not only health checking, whether our weight is increased or decreased. I mean, these are the ways in which we ourselves self-regulates in the time of biopolitics. We have certain consciousness about how our body should be, how our personality should be. So you need to see that, how these regulating principles are already inscribed in our own mind. This is what Foucault is trying to say, that we ourselves become the scrutinizing self of our own bodies and our own lives. So that's how it will become important. I mean, we can see the time of COVID, we get to live with a lot of instructions from the so-called administrators and also experts, but also see, non-official sources, what we can, people would say that, I mean, yeah, this is what I learned from WhatsApp. We don't know how source is valid or not, but we tend to follow instructions of our time. So we need to ask this question, one simple line are we the experts of our own bodies and our own lives, or we are depending on other sources, whether it's WhatsApp or, the Prime Minister's, notification comes from the ministries. All informations are impinging on our self-regulations, how instructions are making our life, I would not say difficult or easy, but, we negotiate with these instructions as self-regulating beings. Yeah. Thank you. I hope
Thank you. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I think wonderful, sir, really.
Yeah.
And the way you answered the questions was so simple, and we could able to understand, sir.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, sir, really.
Thank
and
you.
For your valuable time also. Almost.
I wish to, spend more time on question answers, but unfortunately, these thinkers are very heavy and dense, and their ideas are also very extensive. And
yes, sir.
If I don't go through them, I will feel that I didn't do justice. And sorry for that, time constraint.
No.
And some other time, maybe offline, we can catch up and have some fruitful discussion. Yeah.
Yes. Actually, we should say sorry to you because we gave less time to you.
No, fine. I would have loved to take 2 sessions on two of these authors, but anyway, because I also understand we are all working with constraints and limitations.
Yes, sir. Yes. Yeah. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you. Yeah. Thanks to Dr. Ratheesh Kumar, sir, and all the participants, faculties, scholars, students. Yeah. Now I'll hand over the mic to Dr. Suresh Babu, sir, for formal vote of thanks.
Yeah.
Hello.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yes.
Yeah.
Am I audible, sir?
Yeah, audible, sir.
Good afternoon, sir. Good morning to good afternoon. Welcome. And especially, I just want to thank Dr. Ratheesh Kumar for delivering wonderful lectures. It's difficult to handle this session because the Foucault itself, you can speak more than this.
Yes, you can teach for a semester.
Yeah, exactly. It's textbook. But only thing is that, sir, you covered within a 1.5 hour session. You covered entire. We thought that we will give only archaeological knowledge. We went beyond archaeological knowledge. Yeah. Starting with the discourse, analysis, power, and breadth of clinic, discipline, everything is very good, sir. And Bourdieu concept of cultural capital was very fantastic. And definitely, sir, we will not online, offline. We are going to come to our department in Tamil Nadu and Coimbatore. We'll invite you, and it will be a big lecture to the audience.
My pleasure. Yeah, yes, my pleasure. Yeah, my pleasure.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. On behalf of Department of Sociology and Population Science, Bharathiar University, Coimbatore, Tamil Nadu, heartfelt thankful to you, sir, for spending your valuable time with us. Thank you so much for. We'll meet you again, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you for inviting me, and thank you to all participants for joining. And thanks a lot.
Yeah. Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
And wish you all good health. Stay in good health.
Thank you, sir. Please, you also take care of your health.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to all the participants. And tomorrow the session starts exactly by 11. And though the 250 people registered, but at last we got around 150 people enrolled, attended the session. That's a good number, really. And I think tomorrow also we would like to have you for the next presentation by Dr.
Nagaraju
Kundamedu from University of Hyderabad. Thanks for all your time, and thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you.